And this is our last panel, but not the least. We're looking forward to it. The title of this is Striving Toward Health Equity, Increasing Access to Clinical Trials. We've heard a little bit already this morning about getting people, patients involved in clinical trials and the disparities that could be there. But our panel consists of Roxanne Wood, who will be moderating. Roxanne is the Director of Operations from what's euphemistically called BRUOG, the Brown University Oncology Research Group. Next is Dr. Anne Chiang. She is the Associate Professor, Chief Integration Officer, and Deputy Chief Medical Officer at the Smilow Cancer Center. And we're always glad that Smilow is participating. I haven't elaborated a lot on our physicians as I might have were I doing an academic program, but there's information on them in your brochure. I hope you will read that because Dr. Chiang's initiatives and her research on lung cancer is a wonderful situation down in the southern part of the state at the Smilow Cancer Center. And finally, after all of the presentations, we get to our first patient. So we've had doctors and other health professionals, but we can learn a lot about healthcare from our patients. And I had the opportunity to have dinner with him last night and his partner, Kathy. And so I know you're going to be enjoy this panel discussion. So his name is Gary Savona. So Gary, welcome. We'll look forward to listening to the three of you.
Thank you, Jim. I want to thank the partnership for having us today for a really important topic surrounding clinical trials and the equity that we need with them. So once again, and thank you, Jim. Thank you, Dr. Chiang and Gary, for being here. So why don't we begin with Dr. Chiang. She's going to provide us with some slides, and then we will just have a discussion with Gary, and then on to some questions.
Thank you. I'm just going to show you, give a little bit of background and framework for this discussion. Next slide, please. Just to learn a little bit about SWOG, that's Southwest Oncology Group. It's a publicly funded research network through the NCI and the government. Talk a little bit about Yale Cancer Center and Smilow Cancer Hospital Network and what we've done to really try to increase the access of clinical trials to patients in our community. And talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion initiatives. And finally, start the discussion, which I think will be really rich today, and appreciate both Roxanne and as her role in clinical trials and Gary as actually participating in clinical trials as a patient to be able to give you the patient perspective on what clinical trials are and how they advance care. So a little bit about SWOG Cancer Research Network, and these are slides I got from Dr. Chuck Blanke, who's our chair. It's a major part of the U.S. publicly funded cancer research infrastructure. And there's actually, it's one of 4 adult cancer U.S. cooperative oncology research groups that include SWOG, ECOG, Akron, NRG, and Alliance. It's a lot of alphabet soup, but they all form the NCI's National Clinical Trials Network, the NCTN. And it's SWOG is also one of 7 research bases in the NCI Community Oncology Program, also called NCORP. So we primarily design and conduct multi-institution cancer trials and do data studies and secondary analysis across the country. Next slide, please. The mission is really the same as yours, which is to significantly improve lives. In our case, really through cancer clinical trials and translational research. Next slide. a little bit about our guiding principles, and I think this is important, as Dr. Dizon said, asking your institution what's important. Patients are our absolute highest priority. We are really focusing on the fact that the best science drives our research. We embrace and encourage diversity in leadership and membership to effectively solve cancer-related problems, and demand integrity, accountability, and ethical behavior, as well as foster and mentor young and junior investigators. And I should mention that I have a role in SWOG as the executive officer for the Lung and Breast Committee. So that's also why I'm presenting on this today. The next slide, please. Our member, and you'll see this in the map, over 1,300 sites, including 37 NCI designated cancer centers. We do have representation in Canada as well as in Latin America. And we're reaching, we have members, over 8,000 researchers, clinicians, and 10,000 research nurses, clinical research associates, pharmacists, and our patient advocates who play a really important role. Next slide just shows you the SWOG member site locations. So we're really across the entire country, rural areas, urban areas, all over the place. Next slide, please. I just want to focus a little bit about our impact. And this is, again, highlighting publicly funded research. We've opened over 1,300 trials, enrolled over 230,000 patients. We've had 15 drugs approved by the FDA, made over 100 changes to standard of care because of our trials, biobanked over 1 million samples, and we have a database holding all of that information. The next slide, Dr. Blanke loves to show this slide, and I think it's really important that this does translate into years of life saved. And I think throughout the NCTN network, it's really important to point out that publicly funded research has saved over 14 million years of life. Really important. Next slide just shows you the actual registrations or accruals to our SWOG, through our SWOG sites, and that's over 5,000 or around 5,000 a year. And the next slide shows you why I'm talking about therapeutic clinical trials with public sponsor. There are commercially sponsored trials. That's through pharmaceutical companies, many of them who are outside, and that's really important to spur research. But the goals are a little bit different, and this just highlights, for the particular sponsor, they're looking at their drug registration and label extension. They're really looking at expanding market share and creating value. Obviously, that's really important for cancer, but for public sponsors and for publicly sponsored research, we have the ability to really optimize treatment and focus on working with different companies, creating new knowledge and improving public health. That's really the goal for our institutions. Next slide. So again, publicly funded research is important because we can study less expensive treatment options. For example, adjuvant therapy that lasts for less time. We can combine and compare drugs developed by different sponsors. That's really very important. We can allow development of therapies for rare diseases, because if you're surveying over the entire country, you can actually find enough patients to do those trials. Often we can address optimal dosing or test multimodality therapies, so radiation in combination with drugs. And we really do have the ability to identify patients and tumor subsites most likely to benefit from interventions. Next slide. Again, we can focus on screening and prevention, survivorship, palliative care, end of life, and quality of life issues. We feel it's very important to publish negative results because patients have participated in those trials, and there's a lot of really important information there, even if the trial is negative. And we do have studies looking at cost effectiveness, financial toxicity for our patient reported outcomes, as you heard this morning. And I think also provides the gold standard data for registry studies leading to FDA approval. So the next slide shows you some of the last year highlights. So we were able to launch 10 trials and publish 100 manuscripts and abstracts. We had our virtual group meetings and we had a hybrid in the fall. And I do want to highlight that this year was really focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We awarded the first DEI Career Development Award. We brought on a DEI consulting firm to help us diversify leadership and membership, and we recruited DEI champions to work with all our committees. We also just appointed our new vice chair of DEI, which is actually our very own Dr. Dawn Dizon. So that's brand new off the press. And we welcomed new members as well. Next slide, I just want to spend a little bit of time on the bringing this down to the community level in the state of Connecticut. This is Lake Manabazit. And as you see, the beautiful colors, which I saw as I was driving up from New Haven. Next advance, please. So I think it's important to highlight how you do have to have institutional vision to build a clinical trials network. This was the vision as part of our network from the very beginning. Advance, please. We think that innovation, clinical trials are really part of innovation and needed to improve our patients' outcomes and care. Advance, please. We realize that you have to have that dedicated research staff and infrastructure to support our patients through clinical trials. And finally, advance to engagement. We spend a lot of time trying to engage our patients, our research staff, our physicians and community. And I think that's what really reaps the rewards. And that's really very much like you're doing here today as well. Next slide, just a slide about the Yale Cancer Center. I'll just highlight that we do receive a lot of direct funding and for cancer and NCI direct funding. And the next slide really shows you that, if you advance, our expansion of Smilow across our state. And so when I started at Smilow about 10 years ago, there were clinical trials really only in that yellow star in New Haven. And over the past 10 years, we've been able to create a network of 15 different sites across the state, serving about 50% of newly diagnosed cancer patients. And in Rhode Island, Dr. Bob Legary is here. He's our medical director at Westerly, at Smilow Westerly. And what is really important is that from the beginning, we saw this as an opportunity to bring clinical trials to patients where they live. So to be able to leverage some of that really exciting Yale science and be able to offer it to patients where their support networks are, where they don't have to spend time and money driving into New Haven or up to Boston or to New York, for example, and they can still reap the benefits of clinical trials at home. And so if you advance, this just shows you the growing pains of starting 10 years ago. We only had a few patients accrued on, and then in 2020, we had around 200 patients that were able to go onto clinical trials where they live. And that's about a third. That year, I think we had about 800 total accruals in our cancer center. Usually we're about at 25% of our trial accruals in our communities. So that next slide. So why consider clinical research at Yale? Again, we're leveraging our scientific excellence and the fact that we are one of the only NCI comprehensive cancer care facilities in New England. We're really focused on high impact trials. We've got a really nice mix of publicly funded, the SWOG trials, industry sponsored and investigator initiated trials. And we have a dedicated clinical trial, phase 1 clinical trial site in New Haven. And next advance, please. Again, really important. We're really passionate about advancing clinical trials into the community. We think this extends the impact to patients in where they live within their own support systems, and expands their access to cutting edge technology aimed towards improving outcomes. And during the question and answer, I'll be able to talk a little bit about individual patients who've really benefited from this. And I do believe that being treated by the clinical research team provides an extra level of care, an extra level of quality care. And I see a number of Roxanne's nodding, and I see Fran here and other people who are involved in clinical trials. The next slide just shows you, highlights just some of the impact of our Yale Cancer Center trials. There have been 4 approvals just in 2020 from the FDA that were led by trials with our faculty, Dr. Burtness, Dr. Petrolak, Dr. Herbst-Lung, and these trials were open across the state. So these were pivotal trials that were advancing, have advanced the care of patients all over the country and nationally, and people who were our patients helped to put that forward and also were able to access that care. Next slide. Just a word about diversity and inclusion. So we have a number of initiatives. Andrea Silver is one of our docs to the left, and she started this initiative called Own It, Oncologists Welcome New Haven into Trials, working with community groups, asking them to weigh in into study design and questions that they think are important for their communities, and then building that relationship so that when we are looking for patients or want to make sure that we communicate to patients what's available, we have that relationship of trust. Next slide, or advance, please. The Center for Community Engagement and Health Equity, CHE, this is really fantastic work that's led by Marcella Noonan-Smith, who's actually a Yale faculty that's leading Joe Biden's task force on health equity. And she's, again, working in a myriad different approaches to involve the community in all sorts of analytics, engagement, screening, prevention, clinical trial, and research. And then finally, if you advance, we just, Dr. Pat LaRusso, who runs our phase 1 unit, just got a grant, big grant, that's focusing on hybrid decentralization for phase 1. So phase 1, usually you have to travel into New Haven for that. She's trying to create a model that can allow, again, patients who are in more urban areas to stay there and to have some of their visits, again, where they live, and reduce the burden of participating in trials if there is one. And I think I'll just end there. The last slide just shows a number of questions that I think that we can go to during the question and answer period. I want to thank the organizers for the opportunity to speak here, and I also always want to thank both our investigators and our patients who participate in clinical trials for all that they do. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chiang. I have one question, if I may, before we move on to Gary. You had noted that SWOG is currently in Canada and Latin America. I forgive me because I'm not involved with SWOG any longer. Have we learned anything being involved in those countries, particularly in Latin America? If you even know the answer to that.
That's a great question. There's the Latin American Initiative. They are participating in some of our clinical trials. There are a lot of barriers. For example, there are certain drugs that are standard of care here, and they're just not available in those countries. So, you know, I think we're learning a lot about how you can do clinical trials there. That work is led by Dr. Mariana Chavez McGregor, and I've had the opportunity of speaking. Last week was the Young Investigator Workshop in Seattle, and worked with one of the young investigators that course, and he came from Latin America, and he's a radiation oncologist there, and they were trying to do activate a clinical trial. He was bringing the radiation equipment with him in his through the airport security. And, you know, so there's all these steps that start with people who are really passionate about clinical research, passionate about providing that for their patients, but then working through all the different pieces and difficulties of actually activating. So we're learning about that.
Absolutely. And I do have one more question. I'm sorry, that really wasn't part of, but your talk was really informative. And in the state of Connecticut, you're bringing clinical trials into the community. I wonder, have we been able to learn from that process and do we have members of Yale that go in, and forgive me, I didn't see your slides at the end there. So are there members on your team that really connect with the community and are culturally part of that? I think, the panel with Dr. Dizon really went into that a little bit. And has enrollment, diversity in clinical trials, has that been more prominent, I guess one would say?
So great questions. I'll say first that by having care centers, our Smilow care centers, close to where people live, and I'll highlight Dr. McCleary and Westerly, even though he's shy, you don't mind, Bob, but because he's part of that community, he knows people in the community, he is aware and can, already there's a trust level it's so important, as Dr. Dizon and the previous panel talked about, during COVID, the trust level with the medical healthcare system has been challenging. And so I think by having people who are, number one, in your community that it helps that first step. And then I think that, the work that we've done around starting to reach out to organizations and ask them to come in and say, hey, what do you want to know? What are your questions? What barriers do you have? What are you anxious about? And this may not be for you, but let's make sure that you understand what it is. And I think that has really, it has helped us in our cancer grant to help to increase our level of access to patients with diverse backgrounds.
Bidirectional communication is really key. I don't know if anyone else has a question for Dr. Chiang before we go on.
I don't have a question, but a statement. Your slide indicating the branches that are available to folks. I live in Groton, Connecticut, and forgive me, I'll get to that in a moment, but I live in Groton, Connecticut, and that travel driving myself just over an hour to the Yale hospital, and having that offsite location in Waterford was a godsend. So that was very important. So thank you. And
it's a beautiful one.
I wanted to mention that.
Well, this is a good segue. Gary is here and graciously agreed to be here to share his experience as a patient and also a participant on a clinical trial. So Gary, thank you so much.
Good afternoon all, and I'm getting used to the microphone, so please forgive me. Thank you for having me here. I'm humbled, and the talent in this room, and I'm sure streaming live is incredible. So again, thanks for having me here today. Gary Savona, Groton, Connecticut resident, father of two incredible children, both grown and married, nearing 30 years old now. I feel old saying that. I've been blessed to be a fleet support design supervisor at Electric Boat in Groton. Spent some of my time at Quonset, but the majority of the time is at the Groton facility. And my role here today is to hopefully provide some feedback about my cancer journey, as well as being involved in the clinical study that was available to me, and I was able to jump on and run with that. My cancer backstory, this is a 2020 timeframe. I was getting off and on. The posterior nosebleeds is what I thought. I'd wake up in the evening choking, and I just assumed, hey, there must be something going on in my sinuses. And I made multiple trips to the emergency room, trying to identify, what was the cause. And each time I was sent home, I believe with Afrin, medical community can help me to do something to the vessels within the nose. And the third occasion, I was disappointed on my own trying to find an ear, nose, and throat specialist. And I requested some help, so I didn't get the typical response where, sure, there's a 6-month wait for a new patient. And the next morning, again, I'm going to say blessed quite a bit, but the the team and the trust. I've met some incredibly talented folks within the medical community. And they made an appointment for me to Dr. Delacono in Mystic, Connecticut, where I was scoped and he identified a tumor on my right tonsil. And to me, it was bleeding significantly. I'm sure it was normal from what he was saying, but he still wanted me to first have that looked at to ensure that there wasn't any significant bleeding involved. So on that day, I was sent to Yale emergency room. And that's a story in itself with the COVID that was going on. And so first I had to get cleared through the significant, rightfully so, COVID protocol. And the first thing they did, they wanted to scan to identify that this was some minor feeder vessels and nothing serious, which would have been at the time more of a concern than obviously the cancer. And after that was cleared and the bleeding was not a concern, I was sent to the 14th floor and admitted to Smilow. And imagine I was concerned and nervous, and this was unknown to me, and just how 14 floors, and there may be more. It was just it was incredible to me, the amount of folks that were there having a similar journey to me. That was another humbling experience as a patient. And the next day, I was biopsied, and that's where they determined that I was diagnosed with, and forgive some of the pronunciations, you got to work with me, oropharyngeal cancer. And specifically, as it was explained to me, stage 2 plus human papillomavirus. And again, that was in my right tonsil, and subsequent scans indicated that the lymph nodes, there was some spread to the lymph nodes as well. So that was the diagnosis. The treatment that was discussed with me was that surgery may not be the best path for me. And I don't know all the details. I've kind of blocked some of that insanity in the back of my mind, but it was a quality of life discussion where we think we can do this with traditional treatments and not have to use the surgical path. And the regimen that was discussed was 8 weeks of radiation, Monday through Friday. It was determined that 4, and forgive me if this is not the right terminology, but 4 arcs of radiation to the targeted areas that they were looking at, as well as cisplatin every Tuesday for 8 weeks. And at the time of the beginning of my treatment, we discussed this clinical trial to see if that was something that I wanted to be involved in. And I certainly lost a lot of sleep over that. But there was no question I was going to jump in and give that a go. And that, I want to make sure I'm not jumping ahead here. So that was presented to me at the time of the traditional treatment. Jumping into the clinical study and immunotherapy, I was part of 2 teams or groups. One group was to receive, let me get this right, nivolumab every 28 days for 12 infusions. And these were weekly infusions as well. And that was to take place immediately after, in my case, I believe it was 2 months after my traditional treatment. And the other folks within this study were going to be monitored as I was, and then given that immunotherapy if the cancer had reared its ugly head. So no placebo. This was, you either get it or you don't. When you sign up initially, you don't know that, but we were told which part of the study that we were in. And the first couple frightened me because I did have some issues. Again, I don't want to speak like this is my field. It's not, but you know, you ask the immune system and these wonderful drugs we're developing to help us. Sometimes when you awaken that immune system, it was an interesting couple of months. Thank goodness, the remainder of my treatment on that immunotherapy, I don't recall having any major issues. So here I am, well, over a year out of that treatment. I would like to mention my treatment team. And Dr. Chiang, you had mentioned during your presentation, trust. Man, I've met some incredible doctors and surgeons and nutritionalists and social workers. And and I did it again, and I'm sorry. Sorry. So Dr. Newton was my medical oncologist, and Dr. Newton was the doctor that presented the clinical study. And I thank him dearly for giving me that option. Dr. Jethawa was my radiation oncologist. Saliva glands. Dr. Jethawa, my radiation oncologist, another wonderful man. I believe he left shortly after my treatment to, I believe, move out west with his family, if I'm not mistaken, but a wonderful man. And Dr. J had taken over, and I've been meeting with him on a regular basis. And another incredible person, Dr. Verma, who I believe is a surgical oncologist. However, she's the one that provides me with my scans. So in addition to this, the traditional CT scans, and I also get the visual from Dr. Verma. My understanding is there was also going to be some PET scans, PET scans involved, and I think there was some issues with insurance. So we're relying on the visual scope as well as the CT scans every few months to hope that we don't see cancer again, and if we do, maybe hopefully spot it quick enough. And I believe it's a 3-year evaluation at the 3 to 6 month time frame, and then extended out, I believe, to 10 years. So at dinner the other night, we had mentioned that the traditional path, right? 5 years, did they survive? If they pass a day later, they met that 5-year mark. So I really think it's awesome that we're going out to the 10-year mark to see where I am in 10 years, and to see if this is a benefit to others, to help maybe some of the anxieties that I certainly had. Where am I now? And I may have skipped ahead, forgive me. Where am I now? Is this wood? I'm disease-free. We feel that I had a successful outcome. Still nervous. As I had mentioned, I'm being monitored closely. I have these nagging symptoms, and it's all good. I'm happy. I'm here today. I'm on the right side of the grass. Nothing that I'm experiencing was not presented to me by my medical team beforehand. I was told this is going to be your friend. They were not kidding. So being monitored, kind of a selfish guy. I pray every day that I'm cancer free. And I don't want to get emotional, but I pray every day. I'm hoping that me and the other folks that are in these studies, as well as other studies that are in the works or in the future, pave the path for you folks. I mean, I design submarines and mess up a $10,000 plate of steel on an occasion. I don't do what you guys do. And I don't have that talent or that skill set. So I'm hoping that there's another tool in your toolbox to help knuckleheads like me. And anxieties, man, there was a boatload of them. The insurance, time away from work, appointments. How am I going to drive to Smilow every day? I forgot to tell you about the G tube, the feeding tube. I can be stubborn, but thank goodness, man, I listened to my team. I was advised while I was healthy and not having any symptoms from the cancer, and I'm sorry, I'm jumping around,
It's okay.
to get the G tube so that I could have nutrition. I lost almost 45 pounds. You're not looking at a gym rat up here, a gym rat that can take credit. Cancer helped me lose some weight. And I did the G tube when I was healthy because I had difficulty, and my doctors were clear. Let's do this while you're healthy and strong, so we don't have to at any point, because you can't eat, not get nutrition. Because if we need to stop while you're going through this treatment, that's helping your cancer. That's not helping our plan to keep you alive. And advice to anybody out there that's listening: if the professionals tell you to get that funny tube that hangs out of your belly and you hide under your shirt, get that tube. Anxieties, the mask, even though it was explained to me, that mask, that thing is horrible. As you can imagine with the treatment, I'm laying on my back and I oftentimes felt nauseous. And as soon as the folks left that room, they promised me they'd be back in 2 shakes. But when you're laying there in that mask, that was something that I noticed bothered me. So maybe that's a reminder to you folks to let babies like me know that, yeah, it's going to be scary, but you'll get over it. And unless I missed anything, like that's it.
Barry, thank you so much for sharing your experience. Before we move on to the questions that are on the screen, I just had maybe 2 questions or maybe comments. The first is, it's important, and I know we have a mixed room of healthcare professionals and maybe some patients and et cetera. But I think you made a good point where you were basically your own advocate in the beginning, and you were sent home twice. I guess still symptomatic after being sent home, proceeded to an ENT who sent you to Yale. So I think it's a good reminder for all of us, whether we're healthcare professionals or not, to make sure you know your body best and to keep pushing if you're not getting the results that you need. So what made you do that? What was it that you were so symptomatic, not getting better? Did someone, your family member, or?
So I had what I thought was the nosebleed off and on. And so I advocate for myself and others.
Very good.
Always.
Very good.
I was the kid in school that would stick up for the kid that was getting bullied, and then unfortunately be the bully's target. But it's all good. That was okay. And and again, I don't want to turn this into another subject, but it was really frustrating to be in the emergency room for a lengthy period of time. And I considered myself a good guy, a taxpayer. I raised my family. I'm good to Kathy. And I just wanted some decent care. And I watched folks with coming in with knife wounds and gunshot wounds and, drinking in abundance, and the care was there for them. And I'm like, can you guys please take a look? And all sorts of, well, we don't have the scope, we can call somebody in. And
This is all during COVID.
Yeah. And I'm like, you can't.
Height of the pandemic.
You guys don't have a $10,000 scope just to check me out. It's getting frustrating. I go home and I'm coughing up blood. I'm freaking my dog out. I'm washing my sheets. I'm sorry if I'm being,
Oh,
gross. And So I got really, really frustrated that, and again, maybe I don't understand how it works. I just assumed if we can keep somebody alive that was either a victim of stabbing or, you know, where's that handheld scope to look into my throat? And, you know, I learned that, and I remember this as a child in the past, when I had my teeth cleaned. In addition to checking the jaw and the teeth, I remember somebody looking in the back of my throat. And I thought about it. I'm like, wow, we don't do that anymore. And the tumor that I had was pretty apparent with a tongue depressor. I'm thinking, wow, so should I be doing that myself? I mean, it's hindsight, right? So yeah, but I'm like that with anything. I get my car worked on and I over research it. So I know what these guys are doing to my car. So it's probably just my nature. It's who I am. But yeah, you
Thank you.
definitely need to fight for yourself. And I'm not saying that anybody was ill-minded with what they did. Because let's be fair, these places are busy. And there's tons of folks that these medical folks in the emergency room are trying to keep alive and help get well. So selfishly, I was frustrated with my own situation. But I wish I had a little bit better experience to share in that setting. Thank goodness, when I went to meet with the oncologist, it made me feel good again about the medical
Absolutely.
community.
We're in the right spot. The other question I have for you is going into this experience and, you know, before treatment, I've worked with patients before and, you know, you're still dealing with your diagnosis and then someone's coming in to talk to you about a clinical trial, right? Did you have any experience regarding clinical trials before that? You had none.
The medication that I had taken aside from the immunotherapy, it's all new to me. I was a healthy, never had anesthesia before.
And what made you decide to go forth with the clinical trial?
Twofold. I selfishly want to live. And I'm not one to sit down and take news without what can I do to help myself?
Mhm.
Not one to feel sorry for myself. And I think it's important. And you know, I don't want to take this conversation in another direction, but let's be fair. I volunteered to be a guinea pig. Not in our distant past in this country, the folks that were given experimental drugs were, you know, the folks that might have been incarcerated, right? We talk about inclusion and making drugs available to all, right? Not just a middle-aged white guy. And unfortunately, some of the medication that was used in the past in this country was given to people unknowing, right? We experimented on them. Well, guess what? I'm a willing participant and I'll do it again.
Now there's trust. So in cancer clinical trials, of course, one when withhold treatment, we would only add, you know, in the cancer realm in most clinical trials. So I think this is a good segue into the first question on the screen. Oh, I'm sorry. Did someone have a question?
Yes, thank you. Saeed Alvin from Roger Williams. Thank you, Gary, for sharing with us. I know how difficult that is, so thank you very much for sharing. I have a question regarding the clinical trials. We've been talking about diversity and inclusion. And it's well known that there are some underserved populations that necessarily have their care in the main institutions and they don't have access to those clinical trials. So my question to you is, how do we overcome the institutional barrier? And what I mean by that is that only patients that are within a specific health system can access a specific trials. Is there something that can be done to collaborate across different institutions so then all the patients that are cared for can have access to those trials?
Do you want to take that?
I'll take that. I mean, I think that's part of the mission for cooperative group clinical trials. I mean, all of those, that map with all of those sites, Those are trials that are activated in all of those different sites. So it extends the reach to many more sites than one institution, like one academic institution. So if I'm at Yale, I open the trial just at my institution, I only get this catchment. But if I work through an organization like SWOG, I have a clinical trial for lung cancer that's now open at 900 sites. And we want to get 850 patients on. So that means we can get patients from the West Coast, in the middle, all over the country, and not just people who are certainly people in Connecticut and Rhode Island can go on, but everywhere else. And I think that that's a mechanism. It strikes me, Gary, that you said, every medication that everybody who took a medication this morning before they came, that's probably because of a clinical trial that people participated in. And that's something that is not really on the radar as you go about your normal day. But I think when my patients come and I say, well, did you take anything for blood pressure? That was because of a clinical trial. And I think it helps people to understand more that that should be sort of the bread and butter of how we think about how we can continue to improve outcomes for people. But I think your questions are really important. I think that making that available to people who across the state, in different communities, and I think there's lots of efforts of how we need to do better. We still need to do better. We need to have consents. We need to have people who speak different languages that have access into different communities. So that, for example, if I'm talking about small cell, some of those major trials that talk about which drugs to give in the frontline setting, they didn't have any Black people in them. What does that say about our healthcare system? So I think we really need to expand that. And so thank you for that question. And I just have one more comment about what you said, Gary, and thank you for sharing your story. It's not an easy thing to do. So thank you for that.
Of course.
But that thought, the concept of it being a team that takes care of you is so important nowadays, that comprehensive cancer care. And we have our oncologist, Dr. McCleary, but we also have our social workers, our nutrition, they're back there. Raise your hands from Smilow Westerly. They're a really big part of the team. Palliative care or survivorship folks, it's really a whole team that takes care of the patient. And I think that is an important concept, that you can't just do something in a vacuum now. And everything that we do, we really have to think about the impact on the patient and all your realms of life, your job, your relationships. How is this going to affect your ability to move around, to take care of other people and pay your bills, things like that.
Thank you. Dr. Calvino, I was thinking about your question as well. And I know at the Legaretta Cancer Center at Brown, we have established a community outreach. And what we want to do is, in cancer, that is, we want it to be bi-directional. So for example, one of our first community events was at the Puerto Rican Fest that happened this summer. And we went out there and, we learned a lot in that one event regarding screening, why someone with elevated hypertension to the point where they needed to go to, they were suggested to go to the ED that left. Unfortunately, I didn't have a chance to speak to that gentleman, but why did he leave the table? Is it because of cost? Was he illegal? Did he fear hospitals? Did he just want to keep partying because it was a good time? What was the reason behind this? And I think we need to, and that's just one example in the Latinx community, but we need to have that discussion bi-directional. And, I asked some people that I know, their elderly parents, if they knew what a clinical trial was in general, not even what it does for cancer patients. And they did not. So I think we can do better. I think, to your point, we can do a lot better. And if patients aren't going into hospitals, or our community members, I should say, for various reasons. It could be cost, it could be, they don't speak the language of English and feel intimidated. We have to make sure that we're reaching out to the community to get them into the hospitals, get them where they can have access to a clinical trial. And it just doesn't necessarily need to be cancer. So I think that's a really good point, and we need to do better as healthcare professionals in getting that out in our catchment area. And I'm speaking of my catchment area right now, and in Providence. So thank you all. So the next question, I don't know if we want to go into this. When is it a good time to enroll in a clinical trial? When should one enroll? And we can talk about cancer or not.
So I think that there's a perception that previously was the case that you only turn to a clinical trial after the standard of care therapies had not or weren't working for you. And I think that's a huge transformation in cancer, that now we talk about clinical trials just when you're diagnosed with the disease. And the example that I have for this is that when I first started at Yale, it's about 10 years ago, I had a lung cancer patient, a young guy, who I put on a clinical trial for immunotherapy. And there was not, at that time, the standard of care was chemotherapy when you were first diagnosed. And I remember in our tumor board, and this is a weekly meeting for all the doctors that take care of lung cancer, there was a pulmonologist that said, well, I don't think it's ethical to deny this person the gold standard of chemotherapy when they're first diagnosed. And we talked through that, but I think that, the idea of clinical trials is that if you're diagnosed with something and you can, in that case, he went on immunotherapy, we monitor him very closely, looked at scans in the 6 to 8 month range, 6 to 8 week range to see if that was helping him. I saw him 2 weeks ago and he's free of cancer. This is almost 10 years later. Now he has other things that he's going through, like aging, but he's able to see his kids graduate from high school. And I think that's the promise, right? That we can actually do even better and unbelievably better. We know that right now we can't do that for all patients, and that's why we're studying biomarkers to try to understand how we can identify patients who can that can benefit from this treatment versus this treatment versus this treatment. But there are definitely clinical trials that when you're first diagnosed, or if you're on a therapy initially and then you have resistance and you develop more disease, at that time, there are clinical trials in prevention before you're even diagnosed for cancer. And so it's really just a way to improve health outcomes. And so I think that's important for people to know, because they don't want to think, well, gee, does participating in a clinical trial mean that I'm giving up hope on standard therapy? The answer is absolutely not, especially for patients who unfortunately have disease that is not curable through surgery or radiation. It's going to be a marathon. So you have to have lots of tools in your belt. And if you have the standard tools, chemotherapy and so forth that exist now, that's fantastic. But we need to develop other tools so that we can keep you going on the marathon longer. I think I don't know how, Carrie, your understanding of clinical trials has evolved since the beginning. You didn't know about them, but now you've participated.
So I excuse me, I went down many a rabbit hole, and as you guys know, the vast information that's out there. I made a few mistakes, but I certainly value the approach now where it's a tool up front, not necessarily a last case. So yeah, I would agree with that.
You have a question? Oh, I'm sorry, Gary.
From my layman's perspective.
Quick question about, you could speak a little bit about the impact on the caregiver. As a spouse, his wife's gone through a number of clinical trials. it can be daunting for the caregiver too, where you see the drug, AZ253, and what's the impact on that family member, and what can I anticipate as the spouse in terms of what her medical condition may or may not be. The anxiety that goes with that sometimes is voiced and sometimes isn't, because you feel like you don't want to add more stress to the situation. I know, Gary, you were fortunate to have a lot of support. We've known people that have not had anybody to support them. So if you could talk just a little bit about that aspect of it. Thank you.
Do you want to talk about support during your clinical trials, or your significant other, family members, of what they thought about?
So I have not only the medical team, and I have to be careful when I present the two other individuals that supported me. The beautiful Kathy King, my fiance, we met just before I was diagnosed with cancer, and that beautiful lady stuck by me. And to this day, I don't know what you see in me, honey, but thank you. So I wanted to make sure that I thanked somebody that's very important to me. Now I'll thank Duncan. So I have a dog, and he's incredible. And don't laugh at me for loving my dog so much, but
Good support system.
when I
Therapy.
did feel bad for myself, or I felt sorry for myself, and I wasn't sure if I could, make it to the next treatment, I had that stupid dog to care for.
That's right.
And yeah, so as silly as that might sound, I'm not trying to be silly. I had not too long before my cancer, I lost my mom to dementia, and then I lost my dad to cancer. Yeah, so Kathy and that damn dog.
Caregivers are extremely important through this whole process, that's for sure. We have about probably 4 minutes left now. 1 minute, okay. Well, I just wanted to, okay. I briefly wanted to mention about toxicities, and of course, we always think toxicities of how one feels, right? What kind of, am I going to develop nausea, vomiting, or hair loss? However, you said something today, Gary, regarding insurance and time away from work. So, insurance, whether you're underinsured, have no insurance, may cause what they call financial toxicity. Most studies, if it's not standard of care, it will be paid for by the sponsor. However, it depends on your insurance. We all know that. You had mentioned that they wouldn't pay for a certain time point. First, I believe it was a scope. So, that's something that's real and can cause a huge burden on the patient, in addition to the diagnosis, to the treatment, et cetera. So it's something that we all should, think about. And I know it's been hard on families, even time away from work or driving a loved one, as Joe has done now, and has been amazing support. So in any event, I just wanted to bring that up, and thank you so much for coming up here today and telling your story, really. And I probably won't see you at the cancer center because I'm not at that one. So I wish you the best of luck. And Dr. Chiang, thank you. It was a pleasure getting to know you. And thank all of you for having us here today.